As the polls closed across New Brunswick on Monday night, Green Party candidates and their supporters gathered in Moncton to watch the results come in. The Greens, led by David Coon, had hoped for a breakthrough. Instead, they lost one of their 3 seats. They expressed disappointment with the results, mixed with optimism as voters showed Blaine Higgs and his Conservative Party the door.
Like New Brunswickers are saying, this is not what we wanted. We've been saying it all along. We've been yelling it, and I just think this is proof. I mean, obviously, I'd like to see more wins, but I'm seeing a lot of second places. I'm seeing a lot of new candidates have hundreds of votes, and I feel like that sends a message even if there isn't a win, right? Because whoever's winning is realizing that a whole lot of people in the riding are feeling a certain way, that they might have to moderate what they're doing or, what they stand for in order to accommodate, a large influx of Green voters. My own riding, I know I'm proud of my results. Like, I've got over 1,000 votes, and I was running against, people who have served in cabinet. So I feel like that's going to send a strong message that next time around, they need to pay attention.
Well, it's disappointing in a sense that there's just 2 that's been elected instead of 3. And there's no other places, so that's really disappointing. But I guess the voters wanted to get rid of Higgs, so I'm sure there was a strategic vote in some of the riding. At least it's a change. We got rid of Higgs for sure, like his party really the second place, and he's going to be gone because he won't stay in. So we'll see what the Liberal, they had a good platform, electoral platform, so it's going to be interesting to see what they do with it when they're in power.
Third parties like the Greens or NDP tend to suffer in polarized election cycles where people are trying to get rid of the government, says Mount Allison University professor Jeffrey Martin.
This tends to happen when you have a polarized situation and people want to get rid of a government. It often comes at the expense of third parties, right? So I guess an example, if you go back to 1987 and the McKenna sweep in New Brunswick, Bob Hall, who helped Tantramar here as an NDPer, he lost his seat because there was this wave towards the Liberal Party. Again, the wave that wasn't really picked up by opinion polls, but it materialized at the ballot box. So probably Liberal insiders and Conservatives were among the only people who really kind of knew what was going to happen.
Stay tuned for my full interview with Jeff Martin, professor of politics and international relations at Mount Allison University. He talks about how Susan Holt won the election walking a thin line between social issues and business interests. All that and more coming up. What's your biggest takeaway from Monday's general election?
Well, I think my biggest takeaway is that I think Susan Holt made a very accurate calculations regarding what she needed to do to win this election, to dislodge Blaine Higgs. And that was a very carefully calculated plan in which she would run as a social liberal on the social policy issues, but she would run essentially as a business liberal on the economic issues, so that she didn't throw a scare into, for example, provincial media like Brunswick News or the investor class or suburban middle class voters who are concerned, say, about don't want to see taxes go up, that are concerned about government overspending and so on. And it was really pretty masterful how she did this, and it proved to be very successful.
What's an example of a business liberal position, something that wouldn't scare the business class, as you say?
A key one is saying we will balance the budget, right? And also the refraining from talking about tax increases, right? So you're not seeing the talk about everyone has to pay their fair share, the corporate sector is paying too little, we need to tax millionaires and billionaires more, we should be making the income tax system more progressive. We're not hearing that, and we're hearing balance the budget. In fact, I heard on Tuesday morning radio one of the successful Moncton candidates talking about, she said what I was hearing at the doorstep was, be fiscally responsible. In other words, they're already signaling that this is not going to be nearly as big spending a government as voters may expect. So I think we're likely to be in yet again for a government that's relatively hamstrung when it comes to making the resources available to fix the healthcare system and all the other broken areas of public policy. And that therefore there's going to be a lot of disillusion, which is one of the parts of the New Brunswick political cycle. Susan Holt is a return to that tradition of the youngish, untested leader that people can they can put their hopes in this person because the person doesn't have a track record where they've been a disappointment. And so, I mean, in other words, of the early Frank McKenna and Bernard Lord and Sean Graham and Brian Gallant are classic examples, you know. And now she happens to be female, and there's that breakthrough. But it's going to be more, again, on the economic policy side, more rhetorical change than changes in policy, I do believe.
It's true that she is kind of branded as a political outsider in a sense, isn't she? Because she doesn't have a lot of history with the party.
I mean, she has that experience with working with business people in terms of like chambers of commerce and being a policy advisor. So in other words, an outsider in terms of elected office, but somewhat tuned in. So not someone who comes from the labor movement, not someone who comes from the environmental movement.
Yes.
Someone, again, the business liberal aspect of things, right? So, and really the archetype of the business liberal was Frank McKenna. And in his case, he brings in neoliberal policy to New Brunswick, but most governments since have ratified that, and they've continued along in that track, right? So we're still going to be very dependent on private investment. We're still going to be, I think landlords will still have the upper hand in terms of their dealing with tenants. I don't think we're going to see a big expansion of things like public housing initiatives. We're going to see this and we're going to see that, but I think we're going to see probably a lot of piecemeal type efforts. They're already talking about reallocating money in healthcare rather than new money for healthcare. So I think it's going to be very difficult for them to meet expectations. I think they've created expectations, but I mean that's again part of the New Brunswick political cycles. These expectations, a serial process in the sense of a repetitive process of creating expectations and disappointing them, and then seeing if you can get elected a second time or see what happens. And so it's obviously there's in some circles quite a bit of jubilation and lots of talk about change. But again, I think when we hit the ground and we see how things unfold, I think it's going to be much more modest ultimately.
You mentioned the power of the landlords. It probably bears mentioning that the Liberals have committed to a rent cap of 3%, haven't they?
Sure. And I think one of the questions will be, I think like past governments, if one thinks about, the Graham government, the Gallant government, I think they will be very careful to try to meet the letter of their promises, but you may have something that will happen in a year and then will disappear. In other words, I expect they're going to do their best to meet the letter of the promises they've made, but that won't necessarily be sustained through a whole term. So we may see, and landlords and landlord groups may be told this. We're doing this now because we see kind of an emergency situation, but we don't see this as a long-term thing. I don't think that as a long-term thing, we're going to see that kind of policy from this government.
Interesting. It certainly these election results also indicate, I think, a pretty strong rebuke for the Higgs, for Blaine Higgs and his style of government. Talk about what this means for, I guess, the conservative movement in New Brunswick, seeing that Blaine Higgs lost his seat, Ernie Steeves, Greg Turner, Ted Fleming, the Attorney General.
Sure. Yeah.
What does this mean for the Tories?
Well, there's no doubt in my mind that this is one of those positive moments where I think politicians were held to account. So Ted Fleming, who is has proven himself to be a somewhat unpleasant person, finally, and I could say it's a family program, right? I could say more on that, but mean, he's finally being held to account. He's finally getting some comeuppance, right? So I think people have, I think they've kind of acted against a sneering and against people belittling other people, and I think there's kind of like there's an element of this, of a reassertion of New Brunswick political values, of maritime political values, of some sense of treating people with dignity and those kinds of things. And so I think that one doesn't always get this impression in the mainstream media, because they often, I think, I don't know if we would say they perform gullibility, but this whole social policy conservative pivot of Blaine Higgs wasn't just because this is what he believes. It's because he believed this was the most likely course of action to get reelected. Because with the wreck of our healthcare system and many of our other public policies and things about public education and cost of living and all these things, the rural tax increases with the municipal reform, you can't get reelected having done all that. You have to get reelected by essentially what the conservative movement in North America has been doing the last 50 years, which is the Southern strategy is pioneered by the U.S. Republican Party, right? Shift the conversation to social issues, away from the economic issues, because your economic policies are unpopular. And had that worked, Blaine Higgs would have done much better. In other words, because I think there is a level of social conservatism which, had people thought that was the most important issue, had there been an intensity on that issue, he would have done much better. He maybe would even have held on to power. But people decided, I think to their credit, that this was kind of a diversion, that this really wasn't all that important, not important compared to the public policy services, the public services that people depend on and are very concerned about, right? So credit to New Brunswickers for seeing through the strategy, and credit to, again, Susan Holt for hammering away on those public issues and not taking the bait to allow this election to become about the use of pronouns in schools, right?
Yes.
So that becomes a minor part of the Liberal platform, but it's sort of like she won this election, I think, based on the dissatisfaction with the Higgs government, which frankly they greatly valued more running big surpluses and reducing the debt. That was their highest goal. And that doesn't fly with New Brunswickers, and that's been proven, right? So this was a failure of the kind of social conservative pivot that you see in all throughout North America, including the Federal Conservative Party, and a warning in a sense that at least in this case, people they didn't go for it. And I think they also, the things that came out, I think the things that came out, that the overspending in travel in the Department of Tourism and Tammy Scott Wallace, that kind of stuff hurts. The aloofness, and frankly too, the other thing that the media hasn't really discussed is that, I think Blaine Higgs was the most conservative premier that New Brunswick's had in 60 years or more. You have to go back to the 50s, Hugh John Fleming. Higgs may even be more conservative than Hugh John Fleming, and part of it is because he's not really a Democrat in a small d sense. He believes in the trustee theory of Edmund Burke of the 18th century, which is, you elect me and you put trust in me, and I'm going to do things as I see fit. And then in 4 years, you get to turf me out if you don't like it. Right? That's why he makes so few promises. He doesn't believe in promises. He doesn't believe in government that promises to do things that are popular. He thinks that doing things that are unpopular is good for people. Like running fiscal surpluses so that you reduce the debt, so that you're less vulnerable in the future from bondholders and creditors, and and if you keep interest rates down, you have more money for services and things like this, and cutting taxes and all that. Starve the beast, as the Republican Party says in the U.S. That's what he believes in. It's unpopular, but that's his philosophy, right? So and it failed. and people rebuked it. People believe in a more, elected officials as instructed delegates, elected officials as people who will implement a party platform that is sort of full of commitments that are symbolic of the commitments of the government, right? Mm-hmm. So I think those are the significant things. You don't get much from the mainstream media because they don't really want to go to this depth, or they don't want to. But I think people should be told this. They can understand it. I think that this is what's going on beneath the surface.
It's fascinating. You alluded to policy 713 and the with children's pronouns in school, the sexual diversity and inclusion policy that caused so much controversy. Higgs really threw in his lot with this kind of hard right movement that kind of glomming on to some of these kind of trends, it seems, in kind of alt-right sort of online rhetoric, and you really see a lot. It really inspired a lot of activity online, for people who monitor these, various municipal, local Facebook groups and stuff like that. There seemed to be a lot of enthusiasm for some of these policies, and not to mention his partnership with the Tory's partnership with Rebel News, which the NB Media Co-op reported on earlier this year, and these kind of apparent sort of dog whistle race baiting tactics, like with significantly with First Nations title cases, basically indicating several times in his remarks that ordinary landowners could stand to lose out somehow with these things. Do you see this as these election results as a rejection of those policies, of those attitudes by the larger public?
I think so. I think there is this. I mean, Blaine Higgs still got in the mid-30s in terms of the popular vote, right? There's a hardcore minority that is very active and whole hog, and who knows how many of these things are bots as well, and all the rest of it. How many of these are real people? Who knows? Because that's the world we're living in. But there's a hardcore minority, but that's what they are. I mean, Blaine Higgs's so-called majority government was always a minority movement. It never had majority support. Susan Holt is in the high 40s in popular vote, but she's not quite at the majority level. She's obviously far and above anyone else in the field, and so on. But I mean, I think people, again, including too, like in the Kennebecasis Valley, right? Rothesay, Quispamsis, Suburbia, really impressive liberal gains in the three major cities. And to be honest with you too, Michelle Conroy only won by a few hundred votes in Miramichi East. And that's, again, a reassertion of liberal voting traditions to some degree. But again, she was one who went from conservative populism to corporate conservatism, along with Chris Austin in Leave the People's Alliance. But even her seat is potentially vulnerable next time if the Liberals do well, right? So, that I think there was this. I think a rejection. I think a rejection of those tactics. I think people are prepared to live with the kind of centrist or business liberalism, but they want a kinder, gentler version of government. I think, in other words, they don't want. They got tired of the. Certainly, they got tired of. I mean, there were progressive conservatives, the Trevor Holders of the world, Dorothy Shepherds, and so on, who got tired of Higgs's sort of private sector corporate management style, where you get to be an autocrat because you're the majority shareholder or you're working for the majority shareholder. Like that's also where Mr. Higgs comes from in terms of his management style, right? So there are people within his own party and his own caucus who got tired of it, and they also didn't like the pivot to social conservatism. Just like if you think about it, our elite, including like people in Brunswick News, our elite doesn't like ethnic politics. They didn't like the Core Party 30 some years ago and its opposition to official bilingualism. They didn't like the People's Alliance, and they didn't like any signs of that kind of pivot on Blaine Higgs's part. But again, I think he's doing it because he thought it was the only way to win. And he would have done something different if there was a better way to win in his view. He was wrong. He paid the price. Many of his top supporters paid the price. And the Conservative Party the Progressive Conservative Party of New Brunswick definitely needs to do some soul searching and maybe realize too that the way back is for them is to move back towards the center of the spectrum. Because in this election, Susan Holt was in a very uncrowded center, in the sense that the Greens were to the left of her, the NDP is a non-factor, the People's Alliance were a non-factor but to her right, and Blaine Higgs was well to her right. So that and this unfolded the way that political scientists might predict normally, which is to say, Susan Holt had a stronger group of candidates than Higgs did, because Higgs lost a lot of good candidates in his all those candidates who retired, resigned, or whatever. And he was to her right. He was too far to the right. Let's just say that in the age of Trump, we sometimes question that traditional ideas about politics. But when you have a government that veers off on the political spectrum one way or the other, and when it, in a sense, loses the support of mainstream media, because if you're a close reader of Brunswick News or what you see on the CBC website, they were very skeptical of this pivot by Blaine Higgs. They were very skeptical too, to be honest, of his. They saw his promise to cut the HST as kind of an inferior sort of tax cut, because the tax cut should be, in their view, for the investor class, right? You cut income taxes, particularly of high income people, to encourage investment. They're the job creators, after all, according to that ideology, right? So there were a lot of things about what Blaine Higgs was doing that that they were concerned about, and they never sounded a single alarm about Susan Holt. But they saw her as no threat at all to their interests, and if anything, probably think we're better off with a more socially liberal, because the idea is they don't want to stoke the kind of social conflict and talk of civil war and all the things you hear about in the United States. They want to keep that. They don't want the boat rocked into.
Yeah, keeping a lid on this kind of social unrest. And I guess on that note, you've spoken about sort of the business liberalism of the Provincial Liberal Party, and of course they have kind of a tradition or sort of a precedent of pushing forward with kind of privatization and sort of neoliberal economic policies in their own right. We saw this maybe exemplified with Blaine Higgs, when he offered public service workers 0% pay raises at the height of the pandemic, of course, leading to this massive public workers strike in 2021, the QP strike. Now, in an interview with the NB Media Co-op, Susan Holt earlier this year said that she opposes further privatization in the healthcare sector, at least. Now, how seriously do you take this kind of claim, given their kind of their I don't know, maybe credibility problem on this file, or do you see privatization stopping in the public sector and relations with public sector unions potentially improving under a Holt government?
I do think that the relationship with healthcare unions will improve somewhat, just because then there will be a different attitude. I guess the question on privatization is she willing to reverse the existing privatization that's happened? That's the first question. And my guess is probably not. And it may take her a year or two, but maybe I would not rule out some future privatization. I don't think there'll be necessarily as much enthusiasm, because again, I think it's this, she's trying to control for herself what is seen as the political center, and to keep anyone else from horning in on that, because that's where the so many of the votes are to be found. And so I don't see her necessarily I see her being very careful. I suspect that she and her advisors are going to be very careful in how far they navigate in a kind of conservative direction. If I had to make one prediction, I think something that will happen in this term. I think the whole government in the next 4 years, probably possibly within the next couple of years, as I think about the municipal sector, I think they will try to do something on revenue sources for the municipal sector beyond the property taxes. But I also think they're going to transfer rural highways to the municipal sector, because one thing that was done in the last 4 years was to transfer policing to the municipal sector, rural policing. I think rural highways will be transferred. I think that's going to be an even bigger cash savings for the government of New Brunswick, and even bigger tax increases than rural New Brunswick has seen in the last couple of years as a result of this municipal reform. And that will also serve the purpose too of getting some much needed revenue together for things like healthcare priorities and so on. In other words, if there's tens of millions of dollars that can be saved because the provincial government is subsidizing rural highways, then transfer that to the municipal sector, and reap that savings for other purposes. Because one thing that was proven in the Higgs period is that municipal reform and these kind of municipal moves were kind of bipartisan moves. The Liberals didn't really put up any fuss, and it'll be very interesting to see if Holt fulfills this prediction, if she'll see any fuss from either the Green Party or the Progressive Conservatives, for that matter. Now, the Progressive Conservatives are going to be a more purely rural caucus, right? They now have very little left in the cities, and most of their seats are in old Loyalist, South and Southwestern New Brunswick, in the rural areas. So that conservative caucus may suddenly become much more attuned to cost of living issues in rural New Brunswick, because that's where they're largely speaking coming from, through like Carleton County and Charlotte County and Albert County and these rural areas. So that it'll be interesting to watch how the priorities of the conservative opposition change by virtue of the center of gravity of that group.
Oh, before we wrap up, I just want to touch on Crown Indigenous relations, because I think that this is a file that probably reached its nadir in this government, with the police shootings, of course, the push for a public inquiry by the First Nations chiefs that was rejected, not to mention what we've spoken about already, the title claims and the reaction against that very publicly.
I think that I think the whole government will. I think they'll come to the table more willing to negotiate to settle out of court, because I think they'll have the capacity to do so. And I think that ultimately Indigenous people may be willing to agree to things that are not outlandish. In fact, if you think about the stress con settlement with Indigenous people, and that's an Irving company, they decided to come because they were named in the lawsuit. And of course, StressCon really has very little in the way of real property or anything like that, so they're not a big landowner. But they tried to do something that was win-win, but I think something that didn't cost them a terribly large number of dollars, but win-win in the sense that I think they're going to get some labor out of this, in the sense of training of Indigenous people. So that may be a model for the kinds of things that the whole government will try to do, which is come to the table, negotiate settlements out of court, and try to do some things that will both satisfy, relatively speaking, Indigenous people, but also provide some broader social benefit in terms of social development and so on, and the inclusion of Indigenous people in New Brunswick society. So, in other words, the tendency for this to be a kind of a political football for the government will go. This won't be like one of the things that, and the same may be true too if you think about it, of systemic racism, and this was something else that Higgs government was very poor on. I think you're going to see at least the rhetoric and performance of inclusion of racialized minorities in New Brunswick from the Holt government, and not kind of like the dismissal of these things being kind of like a core philosophical perspective in the way they were, I think, for the Conservative Party. And so it's just a question of they'll do as much as they think they should do to maintain their brand, as it were. Again, it goes back to that very calculated positioning. So I think we're going to see. I mean, I think we're going to see a lot of improvements in certain ways. Maybe some of them cosmetic. I mean, things to like. I think the Holt government will be better for the university sector, for example, and the community college sector than the Higgs government was in terms of funding, or at least in terms of valuing highly educated people and realizing that they're important in terms of the future of the province, as opposed to a suspicion of highly educated people, which I think in movement conservatism is now kind of an issue. So I do think that we're going to see some improvements, but I think they may well fall short of what people maybe were led to believe. And that again goes back to I think the whole government is willing to spend if there's a structural surplus now, I think they're willing to spend it. But I'm sure that the government is yet again underestimating revenues and overestimating expenses or whatever. Probably online to have a big surplus, and I suspect the whole government will be prepared to spend it. But again, they're going to be very reluctant to go into deficit. They're going to be very reluctant to increase taxes on high income people and the corporate sector who can well afford to pay, but who don't want to pay. And I think that's an important constituency for business liberals ultimately, which is again one of the foundational commitments.
And finally, Professor Martin, the results for the Green Party, obviously disappointing for them. Kevin Arseneau lost his seat. I think that the Greens were probably expecting to see their seats increase with this election. Do you think that they were kind of a casualty of strategic voting, people trying to get rid of Higgs by voting Liberal? What's your take on that?
To some degree, yes. I think this tends to happen when you have a polarized situation and people want to get rid of a government. It often comes at the expense of third parties, right? So I guess an example, if you go back to 1987 and the McKenna sweep in New Brunswick, well, Bob Hall, who held Tantramar here as an NDPer, he lost his seat because there was this wave towards the Liberal Party. And we saw elements of the wave last night. Again, the wave that wasn't really picked up by opinion polls, but it materialized at the ballot box. So probably Liberal insiders and conservatives were among the only people who really kind of knew what was going to happen yesterday, less so for other people. So I think Kevin Arseneau is a casualty of that wave. And the other thing too, I mean, one of the differences I think perhaps between Kent North and the two seats that the Green Party held was that people may have confidence that under Susan Holt, fracking won't be coming back. And that issue was, I think, a major issue for the election of Kevin Arseneau and Kent North. And so they don't necessarily see a downside in terms of electing Pat Finnigan versus Kevin Arseneau on that issue. Whereas if you think both about, say, the core of Fredericton and Tantramar, well, there's a long history here. There's a long history in these two places I mean, certainly in Tantramar, historically, there was a strong NDP vote, which has now been occupied by the Green Party, which is to say Megan Mitten has the vast majority of that vote. And also the core of Fredericton would basically always stay Liberal. Like if you think about Dr. Russell King, who, when everything else was conservative around him, he held Fredericton Center, the downtown Fredericton, right, where the universities are and the civil service and so on. So there are strong progressive votes. I've always been strong progressive votes in the core of Fredericton and in Tantramar. And I think the Green Party in these two locations is very much has very much I think there are multiple taproots in the ground for the party. And I think maybe less so in Kent North with its Liberal tradition. It's returning to that tradition now. And so, that it's a casualty of the wave. And also a casualty too of the position of the Liberal Party is now stated to be taking on the issue of hydraulic fracturing. So too bad, obviously, for New Brunswick, because I think he made a strong contribution, and you need people like Kevin Arseneau in the Legislative Assembly. But this is what happens in these situations. It's very hard for third parties to, even very hard for third parties to hold what they have, let alone grow. And you may well see this too federally with the New Democratic Party. If Trudeau stays on, that in a lot of environments, the NDP may lose seats, because if the highest priority is for people to get rid of Justin Trudeau, they may end up voting for the Conservatives. And that's we've seen this many times.
Okay, well, thanks so much for joining me today. I've been speaking to Jeff Martin, professor of politics and international relations at Mount Allison University. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely. You're welcome. Have a good day.